So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along. I'm Stephen Elliott. The company I work for is Llama Digital. That's my day job. And we have a product called Situate, which is used for creating walking trails, audio guides. And hence we were approached by the Stan Shaw Memorial Group to create a walking trail app to commemorate Stan Shaw's life. This is what we ended up with. So it's an app that you can use to go around the places where Stan Shaw worked and find all sorts of information about his life and the cutlery industry in Sheffield. But actually, I'm not going to talk too much about the app. This isn't going to be a technical talk, so don't worry about apps and tech and so on. What I'm really going to concentrate on in this talk is the process that we went through to actually develop the trail. So the route, content, how it all fits together and so on. So the talk is going to be more about that rather than anything at all remotely technical. So this is Stan Shaw. He was born in Worrell in 2nd of December 1926 and died at the ripe old age of 94 in 2021. And he was a multi-blade pocket knife maker. Probably one of the most skilled cutlers Sheffield has ever produced. He was awarded the British Empire Medal in 2017. His knives are sought after by collectors all over the world. And when he died, he had an order book with a waiting list of several years. He's often referred to in the media as the last of the little Mesters. More of that a little bit later on. So when we were first approached to develop the trail, this is what we were given. So it was a list of sites where Stan Shaw had worked and a route connecting them together. There were a few problems with this, and I'll discuss that as we move on. But I'm going to start just by taking you through the sites where Stan Shaw worked through his career. So Stan left school with virtually no education. His father died very young, leaving his mother to bring up a family of 9 children. It was incredibly hard. And at the age of 5, he was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital in Rivelin Valley. And he went on to spend 5 years in hospital there. And subsequently returned to hospital throughout his childhood. So by the time he was 17, he'd had 10 years in and out of hospital and left school with virtually no qualifications, not really sure what he was going to do next. He'd seen knives in gossips in Sheffield Market, and the thought occurred to him that that could be something that would be quite interesting to be involved with. So at the age of 14, he stepped over the bomb wreckage of Sheffield and over the steps of Ibbison's on Rockingham Street, where he met larger-than-life character Billy Ibbison, who was the boss at the time, and asked him for a job. Billy Ibbison turned to Ted Osborne, one of the leading craftsmen at the company, and asked Ted if he would take him on. Ted said yes, and he started the following Monday. He went on to have an apprenticeship of 7 years at Ibbison's and then stayed on and worked for a total of 21 years there. So in the photo, you can see Stan in all these photos, and that on the right, that's Ted Osborne in the foreground, his mentor, and Stan's there in the background. Next up was John Watts. on Lambert Street. So, as I say, it spent 21 years at Tiberson's. Wages were really poor, kept asking for a rise. His wife, Rosemary, kept asking him to ask for a rise. Wasn't really forthcoming. So, in the end, he felt he had to move. So, he moved to John Watts on Lambert Street. He was there for only 18 months. He was there as a working foreman. And he really didn't like it. And the last straw came when he had to fire somebody that had been at the company for a long time. And that destroyed him. He really didn't like that at all. And he said, that's it, I'm leaving. So he moved on. But I love these photographs. So you can see the one on the left is the John Watts buildings in, I think that's around 2002. And then on the right, as they're looking today, so they've been really beautifully renovated. They're now used for accommodation and offices. The next stop was John Park and Son on Mowbray Street. Now, anybody here in the room at Pelham Island could look out the window and it's there. It's just over the river. It's the smaller building in the photograph on the left. The one on the right is the climbing centre. But yeah, it's the building's still there, still in use. It's now occupied by a company called Woodware Repetitions. But that's where John Clark and Son were based. And the story goes that when the craftsmen, if they ever made mistakes, they'd just be tossing the mistakes out of the back window. So with the advent of magnet fishing now in the River Don, they've been uncovering all sorts of artifacts out of the river there. He was John Watts for about John Clark and Son, sorry, for about 6 years before moving to Wostenheim. So George Wostenheim were based at Washington Works on Wellington Street, which is no longer there, sadly. It's now, you can see that the photograph on the left is the buildings that occupy the space. So it's the entire space between Bowden Street and Eldon Street was occupied by Washington Works. You can see the photo bottom right is, well, it kind of shows the sorry state, really, that Washington Works became before it was demolished in 1978. And also, it's quite interesting to see the comparison with the engraving in the top right. So it's quite interesting looking at these old engravings and comparing them with reality, because there's always a certain amount of exaggeration of grandeur, because no one's ever going to look for real at the buildings when they're out promoting their wares abroad. So you can see that there are rather subtle or not so subtle exaggerations in the picture in the top right. And it must have been quite a dismal place to work for Stan at the time. So this was a company that once employed hundreds of people and was now very much in decline. So yeah, it can't have been a whole lot of fun being there. But it was there for about 3 years before moving back to Ibbison's. So I think throughout Stan's life, we see him moving on, moving back to companies again. And so he had 2 stints at Ibbison's, got another 6 years at Ibbison's. They'd now moved from Rockingham Street to Scotland Street, which is now occupied by the theatre, so the building is still standing. He was now pretty much the leading craftsman at Ibbison's, and even featured on one of their catalogues, a cover star. Then comes the big change, really, in Stan's life. He moved on to Garden Street, where he would stay for 31 years in various locations. So this view is, well, early 80s, so that would be just after Stan started working on Garden Street. It gives you a good idea of what the street was like at the time. And he started off back to John Clark and Sons. So that was the company that he worked for at Lowbury Street. Now they were based on Garden Street at number 65. So the building's no longer there. The photo on the right is after Stan had left. At that point, it had been bought by Eggington and was now being occupied by Ibbesons, who Eggington had taken over. So he stayed there for a few years, but as previously said, this was an industry very much in decline, and John Clark and Sons eventually went bust. And at this point, Stan had a big decision to make. So he's running out of companies, really, that he could go and work for. So Rose had been doing a little bit of a research and investigation and had heard about the government enterprise scheme. £40 a week. And as she says, you didn't have to give it back if it didn't work out. So that's what he went on. So he was unemployed for about 13 weeks and then went on the government enterprise scheme in 1983. His first workshop was at 48 Garden Street, sorry. So you can see just at the bottom through the brown gate, that's how you get in. And then it was a workshop at the back. It sounds a pretty horrendous workshop, to be honest. He was paying £8 a week for it. Rose said it was hardly worth 8p a week. It was dark and dingy, but it allowed him to set up on his own and start making a name for himself, really. So when he first started there, he was anxious about the whole. You leave the security net behind, don't you, when you work for yourself? He was worried he'd be able to make ends meet. But on the first day, he went out with a collection of knives wrapped up in rags, and he went round the cutlery shops in Sheffield, like Morton's and Cutlers, Sheffield Scene, Don Alexander's, and came back with £1,000 worth of orders. So at that point, he knew things were going to be okay. It's now converted into student accommodation now, number 48, and it's called Shoreworks. Sorry, so there's a little sign outside saying Shoreworks. So it is commemorated at 48. And during this time, this was really when things started taking off for him. So he was producing knives with his own name on them. He ended up producing knives. There was a knife presented to President Bush, knives collected and sought after by Elvis Presley's band members, Glenn Hardin, for example. And so he's really making a name for himself. And in 1986, he made a pocket knife that was presented to the Queen. So I mentioned Billy Ibbison earlier. So his first boss at Rockingham Street. That's Billy Ibbison on the left of the picture there. He was now master cutler in Sheffield. And Ibbison's had nobody left there with the ability to create the standard of knife that was needed to present to the Queen. And so Billy Ibbison had to come to Stan and request, put it politely, that he would make a knife. So he was there for 8 years, I think, 8 years or so, and then he moved up the street to number 56, where he was based for 18 years. So this was a much nicer workshop. It was upstairs. It had more light, nicer conditions. So you can see how the street's changed from this picture. Number 56 is the white building. That wasn't where Stan actually worked. The workshop was down the back again. You can see the buildings that have changed around it. It's all student accommodation now, pretty much. And if we look inside, so this is the view inside what was his workshop. So there's Stan on the left, and on the right, that's how it looks now. Quite fancy student accommodation. Unfortunately, you can't actually get up to the workshop now unless you contact the people running the accommodation block. But you can peer in through the metal gates. So that's what I was doing to take the picture on the left. And that's what I was doing when I was called in by the management of the company to ask me what I was doing, loitering around their accommodation with a camera. So they hauled me in. I explained what was happening. I explained about Stan Shaw, I explained the heritage and so on. And they couldn't have been more interested and excited in it. So they didn't realise, they didn't know the history of their building. And since then, they've been really cooperative. As I say, they'd be delighted to show people around if they ask. And they put a plaque up on the wall. A little bit hard to see from this photograph, but that's Rosemary when the plaque was unveiled in September. And the last stop was here at Kelham Island Museum. So he moved here to the little Mesters Street in the museum in 2009. At the age of 83, which is pretty unbelievable. I mean, there seemed like there were so many opportunities where he could have retired from the point where he went self-employed, from the point where he moved to 56 Garden Street, into the point, where he moved to Kelham Island. But he just didn't want to stop working. I think the passion for making knives was so great that he just couldn't really stop. But what moving here did allow was to cut down on the amount of time. So I think he ended up coming in a couple of days, used some of the bigger machinery that was here, and the rest of the time he did bits and pieces in his shed at home, set up with all the tools he needed and so on to do most of the work. But according to Rosemary, he loved being here. It was the happiest place that he worked throughout his career. He loved the kids coming in and looking through the window and watching him work and have little conversations with him. And the workshop is still there now. So his tools are still out. You can still look through the window and still see how the workshop was as he left it. So we're going to come back round to the route again. So this was the route as it was originally proposed. There's a few problems with that. And it didn't really lend itself well to be a usable walking trail. So the whole trail was about 3 miles long, which is quite a long distance for a walking trail. Quite large gaps between stops. And as you might have noticed, as I've been going through the places where Stan worked, quite a few of them don't exist anymore. So you're going around a trail to places where there are just gaps where there used to be a building and so on, which is still interesting, but it makes it harder to really make an interactive walking trail out of it. So I don't know if you've seen this book by Peter Machin. It's on sale in the museum. Currently, it's unavailable on Amazon, but you can get it from Kelham Island Museum, and it's great. I've got a copy here, and that has trails taking in different areas of relevant to the cutlery industry. And with Peter's permission, I incorporated some of those into the trail. So what we got was kind of the original route, and then the purple markers on there, places from Peter's book. Now, we couldn't include all of those, but we've included quite a few of them and adapted the route so that there's a a constant stream of places to see. Some of them will be places that stand work, some will be places that are just relevant to the context of the cutlery industry. So yeah, you see the green line there is the route we ended up with, which still obviously took in all the places that stand worked, but just rerouted things a little bit to take in some of the other sites. So I won't go through all the ones that we added, but it's things like Morton's Cutlers. So that was one of the shops where, stepping out into the world of self-employment, Stan took his knives and received an order. So for many years, it was famous cutlery shop on West Street. You can see how it looks now, which is a bar now, but the buildings are all still standing. The incredible Alpha Works on Carver Street, which the scale of it is amazing. And it's kind of hidden in plain sight for me, because I've never really looked at it properly before, but it's just there, it's just dominating the street. It was built in around 1900 and employed 700 people, I think, at its peak. It was built for the Harrison and Howson company. It didn't actually turn out that well for them. I think they ploughed so much money into the building and implementing modern production techniques that it actually effectively killed them, the overheads of that, so that they really struggled. It eventually closed in 1959. We've got Cornish Place down near here, at Pelham Island. Truly magnificent building, and I think for once you can see the engraving in the top right doesn't really exaggerate at all. It really is that impressive, the building. So I think that's great that we were able to incorporate that into the tray. Yeah, and the final stop I'm going to mention in the talk is the Crow Inn on Scotland Street, which has something of a slightly dark past in its connections with the cutlery industry. And in particular, there's a story whereby James Linley, a saw grinder, was fatally shot in 1860. So he'd been accused of taking on too many apprentices, which was a method of acquiring cheap labour and undercutting the saw grinder union rates. This greatly displeased William Broadhead, who was the General Secretary at the time, the Saw Grinders Union, and he later confessed to paying two workmen £15 to murder James Linley. He was also accused and confessed to other crimes as well, like other assaults, arson. It was a pretty nasty time, and he got off scot-free. He cooperated with the inquiries, and as such, he got immunity from prosecution. He emigrated to America, stayed there for a year, came back to Sheffield, and became a grocer. So the app's full of stories like this. I think we've really tried to make the app or the trail as much as possible about characters and stories, and not just a repository of Wikipedia type information. Anyway, kind of the routes we ended up splitting into two. So on an earlier slide, we saw how we rerouted it. We also split it into a central section and a northern section. I mean, the two connect up, so you can do the central section and then follow on and do the northern section. But it's quite manageable to do as two separate chunks, and with the central section just loop back at the end and we come back to the start again. As I say, we've tried really hard to bring out the stories and the characters through the trail. Rosemary Shaw, Stan's widow, obviously such an important part of his life, and many say she was the brains behind the whole operation once he went self-employed. I had a lovely afternoon with Rose, going through old photographs, talking to her, finding out some of the stories about Stan. And some of those conversations, recordings of those conversations are in the app that you can listen to. Also met with Stephen Cocker. So Stephen Cocker was production manager at Eggington on Upper Allen Street. As I mentioned earlier on, Eggington in the 80s actually saved a lot of the famous old cutlery brands, Wolstenholme, Joseph Rogers, Ibison's, by buying those companies and bringing them in-house. But to this day, they still use the same techniques, they hand make knives and preserve those traditions. Stephen Cocker actually met Stan when he was 13. So Stephen's dad was a craftsman, not a knife maker, but a craftsman, and he had a workshop near Stan's. And Stephen used to spend a lot of time with him, learning the craft and getting hints and tips from him. So they were really close. And again, that heritage that Stan had, that really come from the Victorian era through Ted Osborne, his first mentor, lives on in people like Stephen Cocker. And up in the top right, we've got Spike, who is the apprentice at Eggington and is in turn learning those same skills. I also spoke to Grace Horn. She's a knife maker. She works for converted toilets for wood. It's stored itself. Again, spent a really lovely session with Grace, talking about her memories of Stan and how they relate to what she does now. She's a knife maker, scissor maker, corset maker. She turns her hand to all sorts of craft. She's amazing. In her early 20s, she made knives a little bit. By her words, they weren't brilliant, but she'd heard about Stan Shaw and really wanted to learn more about what he did and how he worked. So she was living in London. She gave notice in on her accommodation, up sticks, and basically camped outside Stan's workshop, trying to become his apprentice. And he said no. So that was all kind of rather in vain. So she was so convinced that he would take her on as an apprentice, but that didn't work out. But over the years, they also became really good friends, and Stan helped her out and showed her techniques and so on. So again, those traditions and heritage of the craft have been passed on into future generations of knife makers. But Grace has recorded some of our conversations with her as well, and some of that features in the app. So that's well worth listening to. So that brings us pretty much round to the beginning again. So this is what we created. So it's an app. What I've talked about really didn't need to be delivered as an app. The same principles would hold true if it was a paper-based trail, if it was a website, but apps are what we do. So that's how we delivered the app. If you want to download the app and give it a try, you can just search for Stan Shaw in the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store, and that will take you there, or that QR code there will take you to a landing page.